You know that feeling when you find out a rule exists and you immediately wonder, who ruined this for everyone? Somewhere along the line, somebody did something so stupid, so selfish, or so completely unhinged that the people in charge had absolutely no choice but to take it away for everybody else. Well, today we're going through exactly those situations. Things that were completely banned or scrapped because of one single person. And I'll warn you right now, the further we go into this video, the more people that one individual managed to ruin it for. Let's get into it. The marathon mistake. If you have ever watched a marathon, you know it is one of the most grueling things a human being can voluntarily put themselves through. 26.2 miles of pure physical suffering, and the people who sign up for it genuinely love the sport. Now, in the world of competitive marathon running today, there is a long list of rules, verification checkpoints, and timing systems designed to make absolutely sure that every single runner is actually running every single mile. But that wasn't always the case, and the reason those systems exist at all comes down to one woman named Rosie Ruiz. In April of 1980, the Boston Marathon took place as it did every year, drawing elite runners from around the world to compete for one of the most respected titles in all of long-distance sports. When the results were announced, a relatively unknown runner named Rosie Ruiz crossed the finish line with a time of 2 hours, 31 minutes, and 56 seconds. That was fast enough to make her the official first-place woman and would have been one of the fastest women's marathon times ever recorded up to that point in history. People were genuinely thrilled. A new face, a stunning time, a great story. Except something was very obviously off. Race officials noticed almost immediately that Ruiz looked remarkably fresh for someone who had just run 26 miles. She wasn't gasping. She wasn't cramping. Her legs showed none of the physical devastation that elite marathon runners typically display at the end of a race. On top of that, not a single photographer along the course had captured her image during the event, and not a single other competitor recalled passing her or being passed by her at any point. When officials reviewed footage and interviewed checkpoint volunteers across the entire course, the picture became clear. Rosie Ruiz had not run the Boston Marathon. She had stepped out of the crowd somewhere near the finish line and jogged the last half mile like she owned the place. 8 days after the race, Ruiz was officially stripped of her title. The real winner, Jacqueline Garreau of Canada, was declared the first-place finisher and given the recognition she had actually earned. Ruiz maintained until basically the end of her life that she had run the whole race. But regardless of what she claimed, the damage was done. And in sports, especially at the level of the Boston Marathon, once trust is broken that publicly, the institution has no choice but to respond. Here is the thing that makes this story more interesting than just a cheating scandal. Before Rosie Ruiz, marathon verification was a genuinely loose system. Race officials largely trusted that runners were, actually running. Checkpoints existed, but they were not airtight, and the idea that someone would fabricate an entire top-finish performance at one of the most prestigious long-distance races on the planet just was not something the sport had built itself to defend against. Now, to be fair to Ruiz for a second, she actually first pulled this stunt at the New York City Marathon in 1979. Where she recorded a suspiciously fast qualifying time that earned her a spot in Boston in the first place. Investigators later confirmed she had ridden the subway for part of that race too. So this was not a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a deliberate, calculated pattern. But after Ruiz, the marathon world changed almost overnight. The Boston Marathon and major races around the world began implementing far stricter verification protocols. Timing chips embedded in race bibs that record split times at every checkpoint became the industry standard. Surveillance along the course expanded significantly. Photography at multiple points became a required verification tool. And if you have ever run any organized road race since 1980, every timing chip on your ankle and every scanner you have passed under exists in part because Rosie Ruiz decided she did not feel like running the whole thing. One person, one shortcut, an entire sports infrastructure of trust permanently overhauled. And honestly, It is kind of wild that it took something this brazen for the system to realize it needed to be tighter. The kind of wild where you genuinely wonder how many other Rosie Ruices might have gotten away with something smaller before her. Now, as I mentioned at the start of this video, these stories are going to get bigger in terms of how many people were actually affected. And the next one is a perfect example of that, because we are going from something that really only impacts competitive marathon runners to something that affected over 89 million people watching television on a single Sunday night in February. The halftime shutdown. If you were alive and watching television on February 1st, 2004, there is a very good chance you remember exactly where you were. Super Bowl 38 was being broadcast live from Reliant Stadium in Houston, Texas, with the New England Patriots facing the Carolina Panthers. The halftime show that year was headlined by Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake, and for the most part, it was a standard big-budget production. Costume changes, choreography, guest appearances, the usual kind of spectacle that the Super Bowl halftime show is known for delivering. But in the final seconds of the closing number, Justin Timberlake reached over and tore away part of Janet Jackson's costume, exposing her on live national television to an audience of approximately 89.9 million viewers. It was over in an instant. Now, if you are unfamiliar with the full scale of what followed, here is some quick context. The FCC, which is the federal agency that regulates broadcast communications in the United States, was flooded with over 540,000 complaints in the days after the incident. That number was, at the time, the single highest complaint volume the Commission had ever received in response to one broadcast event in its entire history. The NFL was furious. CBS, the network that aired the game, faced serious regulatory pressure and public backlash simultaneously. Members of Congress were openly calling for action against the network and the league. And the actual consequence of all of that combined outrage, what specifically changed in American broadcasting because of 2 seconds of live television, is what makes this story genuinely worth your attention. And most people have no idea why. The FCC acted quickly, and when it did, it moved with the kind of speed that regulatory agencies don't always operate at. Within weeks of the incident, the Commission proposed a dramatic increase in broadcast indecency fines, ultimately raising the maximum penalty from $27,500 per violation to $325,000. But the more immediately tangible and lasting change was what happened to live television as a format. Networks, terrified of another incident reaching viewers before anyone could intervene, began implementing broadcast delays on major live events. CBS introduced a 5-second delay for the Super Bowl specifically, and the practice spread rapidly across award shows, live sporting events, and live news coverage. The idea was straightforward. A 5-second window in which a human being with their hand on a button could stop something before it went out over the air. Before February 1st, 2004, applying that kind of buffer to a broadcast at the scale of the Super Bowl was not standard practice. After that day, it was. And while a 5-second delay might sound like a minor technical detail, think about what it actually means. Nothing you watch during a live broadcast is truly live anymore. There is always a buffer, always an invisible window sitting between what is happening and what reaches you. CBS was also ultimately fined $550,000 by the FCC for the incident, though that fine was later challenged and overturned in court on First Amendment grounds, which means the broadcast delay policy actually outlasted the financial penalty that triggered it. The NFL quietly changed how it selects and oversees halftime performers, adding layers of approval and production oversight that did not exist before. And MTV, which produced the halftime show that year, lost its ability to produce major live NFL programming going forward. One moment, multiple industries, permanent structural change, And if you have watched any live television in the past 20 years and noticed that the audio or video occasionally seems to trip or stutter for a brief moment, there is a very good chance you are experiencing that delay buffer resetting itself in real time. The whole industry changed because of a 2-second wardrobe malfunction, which, depending on how you look at it, is either a massive overreaction or a completely reasonable institutional response to live television's inherent unpredictability. Now, here is where the video shifts. Because the first two stories we have talked about are frustrating. One person cheating in a race, one moment permanently changing how live television works. But the next story is different because this one is not about rules changing or policies being updated. This one is about people getting hurt, and that changes things considerably. The salad bar situation. In the fall of 1984, in a small city called The Dalles in northern Oregon, people started getting sick. Not a few people, hundreds of people. And they were getting sick in a very specific way. Severe food poisoning symptoms, the kind that land people in hospitals. Over the course of several weeks, 751 people were sickened and 45 of them required hospitalization. Local health officials scrambled to identify the source. At first, it looked like a standard salmonella outbreak, the kind of thing that gets chalked up to improper food handling. But the scale of it, and the fact that it was hitting 10 different restaurants across the same small town, made investigators increasingly suspicious that something else was going on. What they eventually discovered, and it took over a year to confirm, was that the outbreak had nothing to do with accidental contamination. The salad bars at those 10 restaurants had been deliberately and systematically poisoned with Salmonella typhimurium by members of the Rajneeshi religious commune, a group based in Wasco County, Oregon, that followed the teachings of the Indian mystic Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. The commune, known as Rajneeshpuram, had at its peak housed thousands of followers on a 64,000-acre ranch in rural Oregon and had already been in sustained conflict with local government and residents for years before the attack took place. The motive? As investigators later pieced together, was to incapacitate voters in the county ahead of a local election that the commune wanted to influence in their favor. They wanted enough people sick and at home on election day to shift the outcome. It was the first large-scale bioterrorist attack in United States history, and the reason it took more than a year to identify as intentional is one of the more unsettling parts of the story. Investigators initially assumed incompetence rather than malice, which is honestly a reminder that the human brain does not naturally jump to bioterrorism as an explanation when food poisoning shows up, even at that scale. Ma Anand Sheela, who served as the personal secretary of Rajneesh and was essentially the operational leader of the commune, was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for the attack, though she served fewer than 3 years before being released. Rajneesh himself was deported. The Netflix documentary Wild Wild Country, released in 2018, brought the full story to a much wider audience and is genuinely worth watching if you want the complete picture. Now, without going too deep into every consequence that followed, the aftermath had real and lasting effects on how the United States approaches bioterrorism as a category of threat. It became a foundational case study in public health emergency response, referenced repeatedly by the CDC in developing protocols for detecting and responding to deliberate biological attacks. Food safety monitoring systems were strengthened specifically to account for the possibility of intentional contamination, which, before 1984, was not something most public health agencies were meaningfully planning for. And that, in my opinion, is the genuinely unsettling part of this entire story. Not that someone did it, but that the systems meant to protect people were not even looking for it. One group, one local election, and the entire country's approach to biological safety permanently reconsidered. What makes the timeline even more notable is that the attack was not officially confirmed as intentional until 1985, meaning for over a year, 751 people who had been deliberately poisoned were simply told they had been victims of an ordinary food safety failure. The truth only came out because investigators were already looking into the commune for an entirely separate crime, which honestly makes the whole thing harder to fully process. The game was rigged. If you have ever been to a McDonald's and played the Monopoly game, you already know the premise. You order your food, you peel the little stickers off your cup or your fries box, and you try to collect all the properties of a color group to win a prize. Most of the prizes are small: a free hash brown, a medium fries. But the big prizes, the $1 million cash prizes, the cars, the vacation packages, those are controlled by a handful of very rare pieces. And for years, from the late 1980s through 2001, millions of people played this game faithfully, believing they had a fair shot at something genuinely life-changing. The McDonald's Monopoly game launched in 1987 and became one of the most successful promotional tie-ins in fast food history. At its peak, it reportedly drew tens of millions of active participants per year and was directly credited with driving noticeable sales increases at McDonald's locations during promotional periods, because people were genuinely showing up just to collect pieces. It ran for years essentially uninterrupted, which is a pretty good indicator that people loved it. It was not a fair shot. For over a decade, almost no legitimate winners of the major prizes existed. The reason is that a man named Jerome Jacobson, who worked as a security director for Simon Marketing, the company McDonald's contracted to run the Monopoly promotion, had been stealing the rare winning pieces almost from the very beginning. Jacobson had access to the prize tickets before they were ever distributed, and he systematically removed the high-value winning pieces and sold them to a network of co-conspirators spread across the country. Those co-conspirators would then claim the prizes, splitting the winnings with Jacobson in cash, typically routed through a third party to avoid detection. The FBI later estimated that Jacobson and his network stole over $24 million in prizes across the entire run of the scam. And because the fraud was happening at the source, before the tickets ever reached a single McDonald's location, there was no way for a regular customer to have won one of the major prizes during the years Jacobson was operating. You were playing a game that had already been decided before you sat down. In fact, investigators later concluded that during certain years of the promotion, Jacobson's network had claimed virtually every single major prize. The FBI operation that brought Jacobson down was called Operation Final Answer, which is genuinely one of the better operation names I've come across. The name was a reference to the hit game show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, which was airing at the same time and which investigators thought was a fitting nod to the kind of money involved. Jacobson was eventually convicted of multiple counts of fraud, charges that covered nearly a decade of systematic theft, and was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. More than 50 individual co-conspirators were each charged, prosecuted, and convicted alongside him in what prosecutors described as one of the largest consumer fraud cases involving a fast food promotional game in United States history. And here is the part that actually affected everybody who ever played. After the fraud came to light in 2000, McDonald's suspended the Monopoly game entirely for several years, while completely restructuring how sweepstakes prizes are handled, audited, and distributed. When the game eventually came back, it returned with far stricter third-party oversight, multiple independent auditing layers, and a completely redesigned chain of custody for prize pieces from the moment they are printed to the moment they reach a customer's food packaging. The game that exists now operates under an entirely different security framework than the one Jacobson was working inside, and the impact extended beyond just McDonald's. The scandal prompted tighter regulatory scrutiny of promotional sweepstakes across the fast food industry broadly, because if it could happen at that scale, at the most recognizable fast food brand on the planet, it was a fair question to ask whether it was happening elsewhere too. Several other fast food companies quietly reviewed their own promotional security protocols in the years that followed, which tells you that the question was not entirely rhetorical. Now, I want to pull back for a second and connect this to where we started today. Rosie Ruiz decided she did not feel like running, and an entire sports verification infrastructure had to be rebuilt. One halftime show and live television in this country was never truly live again. A group of people wanted to win a local election, and the United States government had to fundamentally rethink how it responds to biological threats. And one man with access to some prize tickets decided to steal millions of dollars from a game regular people were playing just for fun. In every single case, the systems that changed were not just inconvenient for the person who broke them, they changed for everyone who came after. The marathon runner with a chip on her ankle who actually earned her time. The musician whose Grammy eligibility now requires actually performing on their own recording. The viewer at home who will never again watch a truly unfiltered live broadcast. Every person who peels a McDonald's sticker that now passes through multiple auditing checkpoints before it ever reaches them. All it takes is one. That is the honest takeaway from everything we covered today. Most people who ran the Boston Marathon before 1980 ran every mile. Most people who watched the Super Bowl that Sunday were not trying to exploit anyone. Most people who played McDonald's Monopoly just wanted to win some fries. But it only takes one person deciding the rules do not apply to them to make every system around them more guarded, more complicated, and a little bit less generous for everybody else. And the more of these stories you know, the more you start to notice them everywhere. In the fine print of return policies, in the terms and conditions of sweepstakes, in the warning labels on things that never needed warning labels until one person gave someone a reason to add one. If you enjoyed this video and want to watch one more, the video on screen right now is one I think you will genuinely like. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, trust me, bro.